6 women, 6 very different destinies. And at the center of it all stood one king whose relentless pursuit of a single goal reshaped an entire nation. Henry VIII did not simply rule England, he transformed it. His desire for a male heir pushed him to break from the Catholic Church, challenge centuries of tradition, and leave behind a trail of shattered alliances, broken families, and lost lives. This is the story of how a charming Renaissance prince slowly turned into one of the most feared and controversial rulers in history, and how, in the end, the legacy he valued the least would become the one that defined him. To understand why Henry VIII became so consumed by marriage, divorce, and even execution, we have to begin at the start of his life, long before he ever wore a crown. Because the truth is, Henry was never supposed to be king at all. Henry was born in 1491, the second son of the Tudor dynasty. In royal families, the second son lived a very different life from the first. The eldest boy was trained from birth to rule, while the younger brother usually followed another path. In Henry's case, that path was meant to lead to the church or perhaps a supportive role in his brother's future court. The crown belonged to his older brother, Prince Arthur, who had been carefully raised to inherit the throne. Arthur represented the future of the Tudor dynasty. From childhood, he was educated in politics and diplomacy, and his marriage had already been arranged to strengthen England's alliances. His bride was Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess whose parents, Ferdinand and Isabella, were among the most powerful rulers in Europe. The marriage between Arthur and Catherine was meant to secure a powerful partnership between England and Spain. Meanwhile, young Henry lived in the background. Intelligent and energetic, he received an excellent education and showed great promise in music, languages, and athletics. But despite his talents, his future seemed clear. He was the spare, not the heir. Then, in 1502, everything changed in an instant. Prince Arthur died suddenly at just 15 years old. The exact cause remains uncertain, though many historians believe it was the mysterious sweating sickness that periodically swept through Tudor England. Whatever the reason, Arthur's death shattered the carefully planned future of the Tudor dynasty. Overnight, the 10-year-old Henry was no longer the spare. He had become the heir to the English throne. The transformation was dramatic. The boy who had once been destined for the church now carried the weight of England's future on his shoulders. He would need to marry well, produce heirs, and secure the fragile Tudor dynasty that his father had fought so hard to establish. When Henry finally became king in 1509 at the age of 17, the country celebrated enthusiastically. After the cautious and often gloomy rule of his father, Henry VII, the young king seemed like a breath of fresh air. Henry VIII embodied everything people imagined a Renaissance monarch should be. He was tall, athletic, and strikingly handsome. He excelled at jousting and hunting, played musical instruments, wrote poetry, and spoke several languages. At court, he dazzled nobles and foreign ambassadors alike with his charm and confidence. One observer famously wrote that Henry was the most handsome ruler he had ever seen. Yet behind the excitement of his early reign lingered a shadow, the legacy of his father's rule. Henry VII had won the crown through victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field, bringing an end to the brutal Wars of the Roses. But the Tudor claim to the throne was still fragile. Rival claimants from the Yorkist family continued to threaten the dynasty. To protect his position, Henry VII had ruled cautiously and often harshly. He hoarded wealth and watched potential enemies closely. He eliminated rivals whenever necessary. Stability mattered more to him than glory. The young Henry VIII wanted something very different. He did not want to be remembered as a cautious survivor. He wanted greatness. He dreamed of military victories, lasting fame, and a dynasty that would endure for generations. But for that dream to become reality, he needed one thing above all else: sons. That single desire would drive his most critical decisions. It would lead him to marry 6 times, challenge the Pope, and transform England's religious and political landscape forever. And the story truly begins with the first of those 6 marriages, with a woman who would remain his wife longer than all the others combined. Her name was Catherine of Aragon. For many years, she seemed like the perfect queen for England. Born in 1485, she was a Spanish princess raised in one of the most powerful royal families in Europe. Her parents, Ferdinand and Isabella, had united Spain and sponsored Columbus. Catherine was raised with education, faith, and strategy. Her connection with England began at 15. She was sent to marry Prince Arthur, Henry's older brother, to secure a powerful alliance. The ceremony was grand, and it seemed the future of 2 kingdoms had been successfully bound together. But the marriage lasted only 5 months. Arthur died suddenly, leaving Catherine a widow in a foreign land. The situation became complicated immediately. Catherine was too valuable to send back, but had no clear role in England. For 7 years, she lived in uncertainty. Her dowry became the subject of arguments, and she was often left in near poverty. Then, in 1509, Henry VII died, and everything changed. 17-year-old Henry VIII became king and made a surprising decision. He chose to marry Catherine, his brother's widow. On the surface, it seemed like a romantic gesture, rescuing a stranded princess. But there were political advantages. However, there was a serious obstacle. Church law forbade marrying a brother's widow. The rule came from a passage in the book of Leviticus that declared such unions to be sinful. To overcome this problem, Henry obtained a special papal dispensation from the Pope. The permission was granted based largely on Catherine's sworn statement that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. In other words, she claimed she was still a virgin. With the Pope's approval, Henry and Catherine married, and for many years their relationship appeared strong and stable. For nearly 15 years, Catherine proved herself to be an excellent queen. She was intelligent, politically aware, and capable of governing when necessary. In 1513, when Henry went to war in France, he left Catherine in charge of England as regent. During his absence, Scotland invaded England. Catherine responded quickly, organizing the English forces that defeated the Scottish army at the Battle of Flodden. The Scottish king, James IV, was killed in the battle. Catherine reportedly sent Henry the blood-stained coat of the defeated king as a trophy. She had proven her strength and loyalty, yet one problem continued to overshadow everything. Catherine struggled to give Henry a surviving son. Over the years, she became pregnant at least 6 times. Some pregnancies ended in miscarriage. Others resulted in stillborn children. A few sons were born alive, but died only days or weeks later. The only child who survived infancy was a daughter born in 1516 named Mary. In the modern world, a daughter would still represent a royal successor. But in Tudor England, the situation was far more complicated. England had never successfully been ruled by a queen, and the memory of the Wars of the Roses was still fresh. Without a clear male heir, the country could easily fall back into civil war. For Henry, the situation became increasingly alarming. By the early 1520s, Catherine was approaching 40 years old, an age considered beyond reliable childbearing by the standards of the time. And as the king began to worry about the future of his dynasty, his attention started to drift elsewhere. At court, there was a woman who had begun to capture Henry's interest. Her name was Anne Boleyn. Anne was unlike the other ladies Henry had known. She had been educated in the sophisticated courts of Europe, particularly in France, where she learned elegant manners, fashionable style, and sharp conversation. She was witty, confident, and magnetic. But the most important thing about Anne was what she refused to become. Henry had taken mistresses before, and many women would have accepted that role gladly. Anne did not. She made it clear that if Henry wanted her, it would have to be as his wife. And before long, the king became completely obsessed with the idea. Henry's fascination with Anne Boleyn slowly turned into a powerful obsession. For years he pursued her with gifts, letters, and promises, determined to make her his queen. Anne, however, remained firm in her refusal to become simply another royal mistress. She understood the danger of the court and the fragile position of women within it. If she was going to risk everything, it would only be for a crown. By 1527, Henry had convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had been a mistake from the very beginning. The biblical passage that once seemed like a technical obstacle now appeared to him as divine punishment. According to the verse in Leviticus, a man who married his brother's widow would remain childless. In Henry's mind, the tragedies of Catherine's pregnancies proved that God had cursed the marriage. Never mind that he already had a daughter. To Henry, a daughter was not the heir England needed. He began calling the situation his great matter. He wanted the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine, declaring it invalid from the start. If the marriage had never been lawful, Henry could marry Anne Boleyn and hopefully secure the son he desperately wanted. But politics made the situation extremely complicated. Catherine of Aragon was not just any queen. She was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. In 1527, Charles's armies had attacked and captured Rome, effectively placing the Pope under his control. Under those circumstances, the Pope had little interest in granting a divorce that would humiliate the emperor's own aunt. For 6 long years, the issue dragged on. Courts were assembled, arguments were made, and diplomats tried to find a solution. Catherine refused to quietly accept the king's decision. She fought with determination and dignity, defending the legitimacy of her marriage. In 1529, she appeared before a special court at Blackfriars, where she made a dramatic appeal directly to Henry. Kneeling before him, she delivered a powerful speech, insisting that her marriage to Prince Arthur had never been consummated, and that her union with Henry was lawful. She declared that she would not accept any judgment except from the Pope himself. Henry refused even to look at her. The stalemate only pushed him further toward a radical solution. If the Pope would not give him the answer he wanted, then perhaps the Pope's authority did not matter at all. In 1533, Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn, while he was still technically married to Catherine. Soon afterward, he appointed a new Archbishop of Canterbury, who conveniently ruled that Henry's marriage to Catherine had never been valid. With that decision, Henry made one of the most dramatic moves in English history. He broke away from the Catholic Church entirely. England separated from Rome, and Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. Centuries of religious authority were suddenly replaced by the power of the king. For Catherine of Aragon, the consequences were devastating. She was stripped of her title as queen and referred to only as the Dowager Princess of Wales, the widow of Prince Arthur. She was separated from her beloved daughter Mary and forced to live in isolated castles under increasingly strict conditions. Despite everything, she refused to recognize the annulment and continued to sign her letters proudly as Catherine the Queen. For 3 years, she lived in quiet exile within the country she had once ruled. In January 1536, Catherine died at the age of 50. Some believe she suffered from cancer, while others suspected that the heartbreak of her situation had simply worn her down. Her final letter to Henry was gentle and loyal, ending with the words that her eyes desired him above all things. When Henry heard of her death, he reportedly dressed in yellow and celebrated. Some believed the color symbolized joy. Others thought it revealed relief mixed with guilt. Catherine of Aragon had been Queen of England for 24 years. She had served faithfully, ruled wisely, and endured humiliation without surrendering her dignity. Yet even as one chapter ended, another had already begun. Anne Boleyn stood beside Henry as queen, but his sacrifices rested on one fragile hope: a male heir. Everything Henry had risked, his church, his marriage, and his reputation, depended on Anne delivering a son. In September 1533, Anne gave birth, but it was not a son, it was a daughter, Elizabeth. Almost immediately, the pressure grew. After multiple miscarriages, Henry's patience began to fade as the court whispered. By 1536, another loss convinced Henry the marriage was cursed. His devotion turned into a desire to be rid of her. Thomas Cromwell provided a solution. Shocking accusations of adultery and treason began to circulate, sealing Anne's fate. Anne was charged with plotting the king's death. These sensational accusations marked the end of her reign. The fall of Anne Boleyn remains one of history's most tragic chapters. Most historians today believe they were completely fabricated. The alleged dates of the affairs often overlapped in ways that made them physically impossible. But in Henry's court, truth mattered far less than the king's wishes. Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the same place where she had once stayed in luxury before her coronation. Now she entered as a prisoner. The men accused alongside her were tried first. Each was found guilty and executed. Soon afterward, Anne herself faced trial before a court of noblemen. Among the judges was her own uncle, who presided over the proceedings. The outcome was never in doubt. She was declared guilty and sentenced to death, either by burning or beheading, depending on the king's decision. Henry made one final choice that some historians describe as mercy and others see as theatrical cruelty. Instead of using the traditional executioner's axe, he ordered a skilled swordsman from France. A sword strike, it was said, would be faster and more precise. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was brought to a scaffold inside the Tower of London. Dressed carefully in a gray gown and white head covering, she delivered a calm and carefully worded speech. She did not openly confess or deny the charges, but she praised the king and asked the crowd to pray for her soul. Moments later, the executioner's sword fell. Anne Boleyn was dead at around 35 years old. Her body was placed in a simple wooden chest. There was not even a proper coffin, and buried in the chapel within the tower. Her 2-year-old daughter Elizabeth was immediately declared illegitimate, stripped of her royal status, just as Mary had been before her. At that moment, Elizabeth seemed destined to live her life in the shadows of royal politics. No one could have imagined that this child, rejected and disgraced, would one day become Elizabeth I, one of the greatest rulers England would ever know. But Henry had no time to dwell on the past. Even before the court finished discussing Anne's execution, the king had already turned his attention to another woman. Her name was Jane Seymour, and in many ways she seemed to be the complete opposite of Anne Boleyn. Where Anne had been bold, sharp, and unpredictable, Jane appeared calm, gentle, and obedient. If Anne had been fire, Jane was water, quiet, soft-spoken, and careful. Jane Seymour was born into the English gentry, serving as a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Observing the dangers of Henry VIII's court, she chose a path of modesty and quiet obedience. Henry found her irresistible. Just 11 days after Anne Boleyn's execution in 1536, Jane and the king were married. Unlike her predecessors, Jane's focus was singular. She needed to provide a male heir. In 1537, hope spread across England as she became pregnant. Henry remained cautious after years of disappointment. Finally, on October 12th, Jane gave birth to a son, Edward. Henry finally had his legitimate heir. The celebrations were enormous as the Tudor dynasty was secured. Henry himself was overwhelmed with emotion, but the triumph would soon be met with tragedy. Soon after giving birth, Jane fell seriously ill. She developed what doctors now believe was childbed fever, a dangerous infection that often followed childbirth in the 16th century. For nearly 2 weeks, she struggled to recover. The royal doctors could do little to help. On October 24, 1537, Jane Seymour died at around 29 years old. Henry was deeply affected by her death. Unlike his previous wives, Jane had given him exactly what he wanted, a son. For months he wore black in mourning. Years later, he would choose to be buried beside her. Jane Seymour had succeeded where the others had failed. She had secured the future of the Tudor dynasty. Yet history would reveal a cruel twist. The son Henry had sacrificed so much for would not live long. For now, Henry VIII had achieved his goal, but soon the search for a fourth wife would begin. By 1537, Henry was no longer the same ruler. He was in his mid-40s, overweight and suffering. A painful leg ulcer left him in constant discomfort and a foul temper. Yet the kingdom still needed allies. Thomas Cromwell began searching for a new marriage to strengthen England's position among Protestant states. Cromwell believed he had found the perfect match in the Duchy of Cleves, their princess, Anne. Henry sent the painter Hans Holbein to Germany. He returned with a portrait showing a calm, dignified woman. Henry approved the image and agreed to the marriage. Anne arrived in England at the start of 1540. Hoping for a romantic moment, Henry decided to surprise his bride. He disguised himself and entered her chamber. But the moment went terribly wrong. Anne failed to recognize him and responded awkwardly. Henry felt instantly humiliated. By the evening, he complained that she looked nothing like her portrait. Backing out would create a political disaster, so the wedding went ahead on January 6, 1540. From the beginning, the marriage was doomed. Henry refused to consummate the union. Eventually, the marriage was annulled. Anne agreed without protest, escaping the fate of her predecessors. Anne of Cleves was the wise survivor, living comfortably as the king's beloved sister. But Henry moved on to young Catherine Howard. Her energetic charm turned to tragedy when past secrets and an affair led to her execution at just 19. His final wife, Catherine Parr, acted as a nurse and advisor, restoring his daughters Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession. After Henry's death, Mary and then Elizabeth took the throne. Elizabeth I reigned for 45 years, guiding England through a golden age. The king who chased a son was ultimately defined by his daughters, the ones he once valued the least.